Hello, and welcome back to Organic Gardening for Beginners. I'm Jessica, and my goal is to get you out in the garden, grow some food, maybe throw in some pretty flowers, and just enjoy your time outside. Today, we are going to talk about 6 different ways to decide what to grow. And I think normally the advice you hear is grow, based on the space you have or maybe your skill level. And those are true. And I am going to talk about those. But I have a couple of other ways for you to think about what you want to start from seed or go start shopping for those seedlings as the weeks go on that might put a slightly different perspective on your growing list for this year. So for example, maybe you want to grow the most calorie-dense garden that you can. That's what you want to dedicate your space to, your time, your resources, all that good stuff. You aren't so worried about maybe meeting a budget to where you want to save money by growing a garden, or you're not looking to supplement fresh herbs every day, but you really want to grow the most calories that you can. And so for that, I would say think about things like beans or squash or corn. In the short term, those are some of the most calorie-dense food. Any sort of root crop like beets or parsnips, tubers like potatoes or yams are really good calorie sources that are easy to grow even as a beginner gardener. If you want to think long-term, something like a nut tree would be awesome. I wish we had nut trees on our property. I do have a couple of cuttings from a hazelnut that I'm hoping will thrive here. Oregon is very well known for its hazelnuts, but I've never grown one before, so it'll be a new one for me. But having like a walnut tree, or if you're in the South, pecan trees get humongous, but maybe you're lucky and you've got the space for a pecan tree. Talk about calories. And if you are somewhere like California, throw that avocado tree in because it'll take a little while to produce, as most fruit-bearing trees do, and that includes nuts. But anyways, those are some of the more calorie-dense ones, whereas you might not want to put the space or the resources into growing something like lettuce or those fresh herbs that I mentioned, which are amazing crops and valuable crops, but they're not going to provide your calories. So think about it that way if that's your biggest goal, to just grow as many calories as you can. The second way that I think could really help dial in your garden is if you want to choose the ones that are the most expensive to buy. So when you go to the grocery store, those pieces of produce that you look at them and you think, no way, that's way out of the budget, or even just, I don't want to pay X amount for that thing, whatever that is. Like I saw some fresh basil at the store for $5 for this piddly little amount, and it was organic, so it was more expensive. I really wanted some pesto, but I wasn't going to do it. I couldn't justify spending $5 on fresh basil when I know if I just wait a little bit longer, I'll have plenty of it in the garden. We already burned through my freezer stash of pesto, so that's why I was looking at it. But in any case, basil does certainly make that list of one of the most expensive foods to buy, whether at a farmer's market or a grocery store. You could save a lot of money growing fresh basil. Cilantro is pretty cheap, but it's still nice to grow that fresh. Some of the other more expensive ones are like heirloom tomatoes instead of just your standard red tomatoes. But if you really like the, what are those called? Brandywine type tomatoes, the big like Italian varieties, those are really expensive at the markets. And so that might be a good one to buy compared to, say, like a cherry tomato that, depending on your location, might be cheaper to buy at the grocery store. If you like to cook with shallots, or maybe decorative squash for the fall that you like to buy, some of those ornamental gourds and whatnot, that could save you money to grow those, especially the squash. Those are super easy to grow. And shallots, this is a great time to be planting those. You could start them from seed. It's a little bit late for that. I would definitely encourage you to give it a try, especially if you're trying to save money. Go grab a packet of seeds real quick and toss them in. You can start them. I think the soil's too cold still to direct sow them, but you can toss them in a 4-inch pot, sow them very thickly, and then once they have sprouted and they're a few inches tall, you can separate them out to give them a little bit more room to develop before you transplant them. They're very easy to grow. And fruit is another one. And granted, I don't talk a whole lot about orchards or fruit trees because I'm still learning myself. But this is where something like strawberries could really come in that are pretty easy to grow if you can keep the darn snails and slugs away from them, and the potato bugs. We've had some damage from potato bugs. But strawberries, as we know, are very expensive. And if you want a very easy to grow, money-saving fruit, that's a great way to start. I would think raspberries are pretty approachable for even beginners. And even a blueberry bush or two, actually get two because you need them to cross-pollinate, in some containers, whether that's a pot or a grow bag, could be a really nice way to save on some fresh fruit for the summertime. We currently have our blueberries in grow bags. It is not my favorite, if I'm honest. It works for now. We are planning to transplant them in the ground so that they can develop a better root system, and they dried out way too fast over the summertime. It was a pain in the butt to keep up on watering them. So I'm not a huge fan, but if it's the difference of, I have access to this grow bag, or it's cheaper than finding a big pot versus not having a bush at all, then try the grow bag, see if you like it. I would just put it somewhere where you can access water easily so that you can water them regularly and don't do like I did, which was occasionally forget to water them, and they suffered for the rest of the summer and the yield was not that great. So that's one of my improvements to make for this year. Alrighty, next up, the third one is think about what's on the Dirty Dozen list. And if you've never heard of this, the Dirty Dozen was released by, I think, the USDA at least 10 years ago, maybe 15, maybe longer. But these are the 15 produce crops that tend to have the most pesticide and insecticide residue left on them by the time they get to the grocery store. And there are 15 of them, but I pulled the ones that would be probably the easiest for you guys to try out in your garden. Like there are some fruit that I think are unrealistic, such as spinach, tomatoes, pepper, kale, cucumbers, and strawberries. Those, in my opinion, are the easiest for one to grow that are on that Dirty Dozen list. And then peaches and nectarines, I think that one's a stretch for a home gardener, and grapes as well. I bought some grapes. They didn't make it. We are going to try again this year, so I cannot speak to grapes at all. From this current garden where we're at, we had some as a kid, I remember, and I don't feel like we took care of them at all, and they still produced, but as a grown-up, I can't really give a whole lot of advice about grapes. But anyways, they're on the Dirty Dozen list. They are sprayed to all get up with pesticides during their growth cycle. So these ones could be ones that if you want to stay away from as much pesticide and herbicide residue as possible, try prioritizing your space, your time, your budget, your resources for these particular crops, and maybe feel more comfortable buying some of the other crops that are not on this list that you have less of that residue risk with, such as onions are one that, unless they're on sale, I don't buy organic onions simply because they are not known to have high levels of residual pesticides, excuse me, as well as anything in a peel, not a peel, but like an outer layer, like cabbage, where you can remove those outer layers. I don't often worry about buying organic with those, or even broccoli, because they don't make that list. So when I do have to buy in the grocery store, if I don't have enough in the garden or whatever, that is one way that I shop. And so that could be a helpful way to plan your garden this year. Next up, if this is your first garden or maybe your second, and you're still just kind of dipping your toe into it and you want an easy way to have a garden this year, then you might want some of the crops like lettuce or cilantro or basil, or maybe a cherry tomato instead of an heirloom, simply because they yield faster than an heirloom. And so you can get a harvest or two off of them before maybe any potential troubles come in. Maybe hornworms get to your garden, or you are starting to deal with some blossom end rot, which is a lot less common on cherry tomatoes than the bigger paste tomatoes or the heirloom tomatoes. Kale is super easy. Like, literally put it in the ground and watch it grow. It does need water, but that's it. I will say aphids can be a pain in the butt. So if you can, put some flowers around your kale so that it draws in the ladybugs and the parasitic wasps and whatnot to eat any pests that might be coming for it, including the cabbage moths. Those are those little white butterflies that you see floating around. Well, moth. And they lay eggs that turn into those little green inchworms that put holes in all of your brassica crop leaves like kale and cabbage and broccoli and whatnot. But other than that, kale's really easy to grow. And this can apply, you can think of it this way for also your space. If you want easy, as in you're not feeling like your garden is overgrown or that you're running out of room because you're on a tight fit, then look at bush varieties of some of those things. You can get a bush cherry tomato, you can get a bush cucumber. Maybe you stick to lettuce instead of kale. Those are all easy crops that take less space. You can even find like compact eggplant. And although I will say, if we're looking at easy as far as skill level, eggplant doesn't really fit in there because it can take a while to germinate if you're starting it from seed. It really loves the warm weather. But once it gets established, it's usually pretty hardy. But I find getting it from seed to established plant takes a lot of attention and kind of babying it. And so I wouldn't necessarily recommend eggplant for a total beginner gardener. Next up is, do you want to focus on growing what you can or preserve or store? And you want to really bump up your fall harvest, your overwintering crops, whether you're storing them in the house or a root cellar if you're lucky enough to have a basement, which I don't. If I could change one thing about this house, it would be that we had some sort of a basement or cold storage area. But you can also grow a lot of crops that do what's called field storage. So they just stay in the ground all winter long, and you can just harvest them as you need them. And that even works for uncovered crops. So not in a greenhouse or a high tunnel or even a cold frame or a low tunnel, such as kale. I've been eating off of our kale plants all winter long because they're very cold tolerant and they don't need protection and they don't die in the middle of winter. You can do this with certain cabbage varieties as well, certain carrot varieties where your garden acts as your fridge, because these particular varieties are good storage crops. And so you don't need to do that extra step of storing them in your house. Just leave them out in the ground. And when you are seed shopping or nursery shopping, you'll see it stated on there. This is good for storage, or holds well in the field is another phrase used a lot for market gardeners and farmers. Or ones that have like winter in the name. My cabbage variety is called January King, and that obviously indicates that it's going to hold well outside in the cold. So again, getting back to my original point of what do you want to can or preserve? Tomatoes, obviously a good one. You can can those in a dozen different ways, or you can just toss them in the freezer. They taste like summer when you take them out in the wintertime and you make a spaghetti sauce, and you're just going from a super ripe frozen tomato. It makes the best spaghetti sauce. Jalapenos, if you like to dry them, freeze them, I do a sweet pickled jalapeno. Oh, they're so good. We put them on pizza, on burritos, enchiladas. I just had some actually on an avocado sandwich. They are so tasty. Corn is a great one for preserving. We did this where I bought, because we didn't have room to grow it at the time, I bought a bunch of fresh corn from a gal who's got a little veggie stand at her property, and cut all the kernels off of the cob and then tossed them into the freezer. This year we're going to do it ourselves. We've got a little area picked out to grow a bunch of corn. I think I mentioned that last episode. So that way we can fill our freezers with our corn and bring it down one less step, getting it from garden to freezer. Potatoes, squash, these are all really good storage crops. And then cabbage and other brassicas like the kale that I mentioned. Lastly, the perspective number 6 that you might want to look at for deciding what to grow is, what do you use the most of? If you just want to grow a little bit of everything of what you regularly use when you're cooking, then maybe you do smaller amounts of a larger variety of stuff. So maybe you want to grow enough to have fresh salads, fresh herbs for cooking. You want to have a little bit of squash for the fall or some of those other storage crops. You want your tomato harvest and you're not so worried about preserving them, but you just want a ton for fresh eating and salads. Then maybe you just kind of dabble in a little bit of everything. And this is typically how I have grown, where I just look at, what do I eat the most of? No matter the season, is it a spring salad or what am I cooking in the fall? I look at, what do I use the most of? And that for me are things like the kale, lettuce, tomatoes, of course, and onions, carrots, hardly any beets, hardly any eggplant. I get in the mood for them now and again, but they don't earn a huge amount of space in my garden simply because I don't eat them that frequently. And if I really get a hankering for them, I'll just get them from the grocery store or the farmer's market, and do it that way and dedicate more space to, say pepper plants, because I cannot get enough of red peppers in the summertime. They are delish. And so that you might combine, a few aspects of this. Maybe you want to have all your fresh eating throughout the season, but you really want to can tomatoes. And so you go extra heavy on the tomatoes, but you don't worry so much about having a big corn patch or a bunch of potatoes to store throughout the winter, or yams. I forgot to mention yams for the storage crops. But I think you get what I'm saying. Just this one is a little bit easier. This is where you just look at, what do you eat? What do you like? What can you grow in your area? Maybe what do you want to stretch your skills with a little bit? If there's something that you have avoided, maybe starting peppers from seed because it's a slow process and you've only bought the plants, maybe you expand your pepper range this year and start them from seed so you can try some different ones that you might not be able to find at the nursery and just grow a smattering of everything for this season. So just a few different ways to look at it. Again, especially if you're limited by space or by budget, or you only have X amount of hours per week to get out there to the garden, or do all your maintenance chores or process it on the other end. Maybe you don't have any time for canning or don't enjoy canning. And so growing these large amounts of one type of vegetable just isn't worth it for you. And so you want to shift your focus elsewhere. Just a different way to think about it. While we're on this topic of figuring out what you want to grow, I want to preview Thursday's episode a little bit. We're going to talk about the gardener's year and kind of what to expect throughout the seasons. And I think this overview is super helpful, especially if you are a newer gardener, to kind of get a feel for what to expect, some of the big milestones throughout the season that can help you in this planning process. We're talking a lot about planning for these next few weeks. I know that the gardening season is kicking off in some areas, but in other areas you got a little ways to go, including me. I'm certainly not planting out everything. And some of the things I did plant out are just getting rained on nonstop. So that's what we're going to talk about on Thursday. And before I close out the show, I just want to say thank you for the emails that I got about my absence from the show and just being so understanding and encouraging and enjoying the show. Those emails were fantastic to read. So thank you very much for those. I'll talk to you guys next week. Bye.